The word they use in boardrooms to describe what I did for 15 years is profitable. It's a clean, sterile word, scrubbed of all the mess and the soul. It doesn't smell like hot shears and steamed wool. It doesn't feel like a bolt of perfect, unbroken heritage textile, unrolling across a cutting table like a sheet of dark water. It doesn't capture the weight of a legacy, a fashion house that dressed icons, a name that meant something more than money. For 15 years, I was the head designer, the one who translated that legacy into collections that actually sold. I was the quiet engine in the basement, the one keeping the lights on in the grand ballroom upstairs. I was timeless, and for my trouble, I was called an antique. If you've ever poured your entire life into something, only to be told you're no longer relevant, then you know the strange, hollow silence that comes after a blow like that. It helps to know you're not just screaming into the void. So if you get what I'm about to say, let me know in the comments. And stick around, because you'll want to see how this story ends. The meeting was on a Tuesday. I remember the weak, filtered sunlight coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the main conference room, the one we only used for shareholder meetings and major announcements. The air conditioning was always set to a clinical chill in there, a temperature designed to keep suits from sweating. Guy, the founder's son, was standing at the head of the long, polished table. He had that unearned confidence of someone who'd never had to build a thing in his life, only inherit it. He was a walking mood board, all sharp angles and expensive minimalist clothing that was meant to look effortless but screamed of calculation. He'd been in charge for 6 months, and in that time he'd talked more about brand synergy and social media engagement than he had about thread counts or draping. I was there, sitting to the right of what used to be his father's chair, the seat I'd occupied in these meetings for over a decade. I was a fixture. Hazel, the designer, the one who understood the archives, the one who knew that the signature textile, a complex tartan wool woven in a tiny mill on a remote Scottish isle, was the literal and figurative thread that held the entire brand together. I had my latest collection's profit and loss statement in front of me, a neat stack of papers showing a 17% increase year over year, a solid, dependable number, the kind of number that pays for a flagship store on Fifth Avenue. Guy was clicking through a presentation. It was full of jarring neon colors and frantic, flashing images of influencers. He landed on a slide with a picture of one of my classic trench coats, a bestseller for a decade, next to a photo of some vapid neon puffer jacket thing. He tapped the image of my coat with the laser pointer, the little red dot dancing over the impeccable lapel, and then he said it, the words that changed everything. He said, "We need to move away from this antique sensibility. It's profitable, yes, but it isn't exciting, it doesn't trend, it doesn't go viral." Antique. The word hung in the cold air. It wasn't a loud, angry word. It was worse. It was dismissive. It was a pat on the head to a doddering old relative. He didn't look at me when he said it. In fact, his eyes slid right past me, as if I were a piece of the furniture, a part of the antique decor he was so eager to discard. He clicked to the next slide, revealing the face of his chosen successor, a girl who went by a single name online, someone famous for pouty selfies and sponsored posts about detox teas. She had over 10 million followers, and to my knowledge had never sketched a garment in her life. He said she had her finger on the pulse. He said she was the future. And just like that, 15 years of my life, of my work, of my loyalty, were relegated to a museum. I was an artifact. He announced her appointment as the new creative director, effective immediately. There was a smattering of confused, polite applause from the board members, most of whom were his father's old golf buddies, and had no idea what was happening. They just saw the flashy presentation and Guy's enthusiasm and nodded along. I didn't say a word. I just watched the laser dot move to the next slide. I felt a strange, quiet heat flush up my neck, but my hands resting on the table were perfectly still. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Inside, the world had tilted on its axis. The foundation of my professional life, The structure I had so carefully and diligently maintained for the house had just been demolished with a single careless word. He didn't know it yet. He couldn't possibly know. But in that moment, as he was talking about brand futures and digital footprints, he wasn't just firing his head designer. He was handing me a weapon, because he didn't know about the severance package he was about to sign off on. And he certainly didn't know about the inheritance I'd been keeping quiet. An inheritance that, when combined, was just enough to buy a controlling stake in a very specific, very old, and suddenly very important Scottish mill. The mill that produced his antique textile. The mill he had just taken for granted. That was his first mistake. Assuming the quiet ones in the room have nothing to say. His second mistake was thinking that antiques are just old things you put on a shelf. He forgot that some of them are priceless. And some of them are traps. The walk from the conference room back to my office was the longest walk of my life. It was like moving through water. The sounds of the office, the gentle hum of computers, the distant ring of a phone, the soft chatter from the marketing department, all seemed to be coming from a great distance. My feet, in sensible heels I'd designed myself, made no sound on the plush carpeting. I felt utterly detached, an astronaut floating away from the ship. My keycard still worked on my office door, a small, surprising mercy. I closed the door behind me, and the click of the latch was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of an ending. My office wasn't grand. It was a working space, a creative chaos I understood. Bolts of fabric leaned against one wall. Sketches were pinned to a massive corkboard, and my desk was a landscape of pencils, thread snips and swatches. For 15 years this room had been my sanctuary and my battlefield. It was where I'd fought with suppliers over dye lots, where I'd wept with frustration over a stubborn seam, and where I'd felt the electric jolt of a perfect design finally coming together. Now, it was just a room, a box of my things that I would soon have to pack up. I sank into my chair, the worn leather sighing under my weight. I stared at my hands, resting on the smooth, dark wood of the desk. They were capable hands. Hands that could sketch, cut, pin, and drape. Hands that knew the difference between a 20-ply and a 30-ply cashmere by touch alone. These were the hands that had generated hundreds of millions of dollars for this company, and they had just been dismissed. That's when the dam broke. It wasn't a loud, shattering thing. It was a silent, internal collapse. A single tear traced a hot path down my cheek, then another. I didn't sob. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there as the full weight of the humiliation pressed down on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. Antique. The word echoed in the silent room. It wasn't just an insult to my work, it was an erasure of my entire contribution. It was a denial of my relevance, my vitality, my very presence. Guy hadn't just fired me, he had declared me dead. My mind started to flicker backwards, a desperate, disjointed reel of memories. I saw his father, Arthur, the founder, a gruff, brilliant man with an incredible eye. He'd hired me right out of design school. He saw something in my sketches, a respect for structure and form, that he said was missing in modern fashion. He'd walk into my office, smelling of cigar smoke and expensive cologne, and run his rough hands over a new textile. He'd say, "The fabric is the soul of the garment, Hazel. Never forget that. The rest is just conversation." He was the one who first took me to Scotland, to the Isle of Skye, to see the Blackford Mill. It wasn't a tourist destination. It was a working piece of history, a stone building hunkered down against the relentless wind, looking out over a steely gray loch. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of lanolin and machine oil. The noise of the old wooden looms was a deafening rhythmic thunder, a heartbeat that had been pounding for over 100 years. Arthur introduced me to the mill manager. A young man then, Eamon had the same reverence for the process that Arthur did. He showed me how they selected the wool, how the local water, the very peat in the soil, gave the tartan its unique depth of color and feel. It wasn't just a textile, it was a story, a place. I remembered a collection about 8 years ago. Arthur had just retired, and the board had installed a placeholder CEO, a finance guy who knew nothing about clothes. He'd wanted to cut costs, and his first target was the Blackford Mill. He'd found a cheaper supplier in China that could produce a similar tartan for a third of the price. He'd shown me the sample. It was dead. Lifeless. It had the pattern, but not the soul. I fought him. I created an entire presentation, not with numbers, but with fabrics. I draped the Chinese knockoff on a mannequin next to the real Blackford wool. I made him feel the difference. I made him see how one was a garment, and the other was just a costume. I won. The collection made with the real textile was one of our most successful ever. I saved the relationship with the mill, and I believed the integrity of the brand. I received a polite nod in a memo. No bonus. No public credit. It was just Hazel doing her job. Keeping the lights on. Then came Guy. Arthur's son arrived not with a bang, but with 1,000 tiny cuts. He'd stroll through the design studio, talking on his phone, trailing a wake of disruption. He'd glance at a sketch I'd labored over for a week, and say something like, feels a bit safe. He started using words like disrupt and pivot. He didn't understand that our clients didn't want to be disrupted. They wanted to be elegant. They wanted to be timeless. They wanted to buy a coat that they could pass down to their own daughters. The worst part, the part that truly gnawed at me now, as I sat in the ruins of my career, was my own complicity, my loyalty. I had stayed. I stayed because of Arthur. I stayed because I loved the brand he had built. I stayed because I believed that quality and profitability would always eventually win out over flashy trends. I thought my work would speak for itself. I see now that was a profound, almost childish naivete. The work never speaks for itself. Someone has to speak for it. And in my quiet heads-down dedication, I had forgotten to be my own advocate. I had let them mistake my silence for weakness. I let them think I was a fixture, a part of the building, and when you're part of the building, you can be renovated right out of existence. My phone buzzed on the desk. A sterile automated email from Human Resources. Subject: your transition. It detailed the logistics of my departure. My access would be revoked at 5 p.m. I was to return my company property, and it mentioned the severance package. It was standard. 15 years of service got me a generous, but not life-changing. It was enough to live on for a year, maybe 2, if I was careful. It was hush money. Go away quietly money. I stared at the email, and the tears stopped. The despair began to cool, solidifying into something hard and dense. It was like watching water turn to ice. The sorrow was still there, but it now had a sharp, crystalline edge. It wasn't about revenge. I told myself that, and I almost believed it. It was about justice. It was about the principle of the thing. Arthur's principle. The fabric is the soul of the garment. My mind went back to another email, a personal one from a few months ago. It was from my solicitor in Edinburgh. It was about my grandmother, Elspeth. She had passed away peacefully at 95. I hadn't been able to make the funeral. It was during our biggest market week, a crisis I of course had to handle. I'd felt a pang of guilt, but work was always the priority. It was always the excuse. Elspeth was a weaver, a tiny fierce woman, with hands gnarled from a lifetime of working a loom, in her small cottage in the Highlands. She's the one who taught me to see the world in textures and colors. When I was a little girl, she'd let me sit beside her, and she'd tell me stories as the shuttle flew back and forth, back and forth. She'd say, "Never let a man with soft hands tell you the value of your work, Hazel. People who don't make things don't understand the cost. And the cost isn't money. It's time. It's your life. You weave a piece of your life into everything you make." She had lived frugally. I knew she had some savings, but I never expected much. But her solicitor's email had been a quiet shock. My grandmother, the humble weaver, had been a secret, savvy investor. She'd taken the small profits from her craft, over 70 years, and with the help of a local banker, had put it into things she understood: wool cooperatives, shipping companies, land. The inheritance was significant. Far more than I'd ever imagined. It wasn't yacht money, but it was power money. It was freedom money. I had acknowledged the email, transferred the funds to a private account, and then, because I was so consumed by my job, I had mostly forgotten about it. It was a safety net I never thought I'd need. Now, sitting in my soon-to-be former office, the two numbers appeared in my head, side by side. The severance from the company, the inheritance from my grandmother. I did a quick, rough calculation. A cold fire started in my stomach. It wasn't just a safety net anymore. It was a war chest. I thought of Elspeth's words. Never let a man with soft hands tell you the value of your work. Guy had the softest hands I'd ever seen. And he had just told me my life's work was an antique. The ice in my veins wasn't just cold anymore. It was structural. It was a blueprint. I picked up my phone, my fingers moving with a newfound precision. I didn't call a friend to cry. I didn't call a headhunter to find a new job. I pulled up the contact information for my grandmother's solicitor in Edinburgh. My resolve was no longer about getting justice. It was about proving a point. A very old, very foundational point. The soul of the garment. The soul of the brand. He thought he had cut me out. He had no idea. He had just pointed me directly at the brand's heart and handed me a knife. The company wasn't a structure I needed to protect anymore. It was a target. And I had a perfect, clear shot. The first step in a quiet coup isn't a dramatic declaration of war. It's paperwork. It's quiet. Late-night phone calls, and the dry, rustling sound of contracts being reviewed. While Guy was probably celebrating his bold new vision with champagne and back-patting, I was in my apartment, transforming grief into a business plan. My world had shrunk to the glow of my laptop screen, the hiss of my coffee machine, and the steady, calming voice of Alistair, my grandmother's solicitor, on the phone from Scotland. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself this. It was a strategic reallocation of assets. A correction in the market. A man who didn't understand the value of his primary supplier was a business risk. I was simply mitigating that risk by becoming the supplier. It was the most logical thing in the world. Alistair was old school. He spoke in calm, measured tones that made the audacious thing I was proposing sound like a simple real estate transaction. He said, "So, you want to buy a mill, Hazel?" I told him, "I want to buy the mill, Blackford Mill." He paused. He knew the name, of course. In that part of Scotland, Blackford was a legend. He explained the situation. The mill wasn't a public company. It was a private limited entity, owned by a patchwork of families, descendants of the original founders, and a few small investment trusts. It was, in his words, a messy, sentimental business. No one had ever tried a hostile takeover, because who would want to? Its profits were steady, but small. Its value wasn't on a balance sheet. It was in its heritage, its name. Its value was the very thing Guy had just called antique. This is where my 15 years of quiet observation paid off. I hadn't just been designing clothes, I had been listening. I'd sat in on logistics meetings, on supplier negotiations. I knew the mill's financials weren't spectacular because the fashion house, under the new finance-minded leadership, and then under Guy, had been squeezing their margins for years. They treated Blackford like a fungible supplier, not the strategic partner it was. They demanded faster turnarounds, delayed payments, and constantly threatened to move to a cheaper alternative. The owners, a collection of elderly cousins and their children, were tired. They loved the history, but they didn't love the constant pressure and disrespect. Alistair confirmed my hypothesis. He said, "They're proud people, Hazel. They won't sell to a corporation that's been bleeding them dry, but to an individual, to the granddaughter of Elspeth, whose blankets are still in half the homes on Sky, to a designer who they know respects the craft. That's a different story. This was the key. This wasn't a corporate raid. It was a personal appeal. My secret weapon wasn't just the money. It was my history. It was Elspeth's name. The next 2 weeks were a blur of encrypted emails and secure document transfers. I set up a holding company, a shell corporation with a suitably boring name, Northern Textiles Holdings. It sounded official and utterly anonymous. It was through this entity that I would make the offers. Alistair, bless his meticulous legal heart, handled the outreach. He didn't approach them as a block. He went one by one. He'd call me after each conversation. The first one was with a woman named Fiona, a third-generation owner who held a crucial 8% stake. Alistair told me she was ready to sell the moment she heard who the real buyer was. She said, "Hazel, the one Arthur always brought with him, the one who actually knows a selvage edge from a hem. Thank God, I'm tired of dealing with children in suits who call this stuff content." One by one, they fell. It was like watching a series of dominoes, lined up over decades, just waiting for the right touch. I offered them a fair price, slightly above market value, but not an outrageous sum. It wasn't about bullying them with cash. It was about offering them an honorable exit, a way to preserve their legacy by passing it to someone who understood it, someone who wouldn't dismantle it for parts, someone who saw its soul. The biggest piece of the puzzle was my old ally, Eamon, the mill manager. He didn't own any shares, but he held the loyalty of every single worker. If Eamon walked, the mill would shut down, shares or no shares. I needed him. I hesitated to call him. It felt like a betrayal of our long professional friendship. I was about to turn his world upside down. I finally made the call one evening, my heart pounding. I explained the situation. I told him about Guy, the antique comment, the firing. I told him my plan. I held my breath, waiting for his reaction. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint crackle of the transatlantic connection. Then I heard a low chuckle. He said, "Antique, did he?" The boy wouldn't know quality if it bit him on his perfectly manicured arse. Eamon had been dealing with Guy's abrasive emails and impossible demands for months. He was at his breaking point. He continued, "Hazel, for the last 5 years, I've been fighting to keep this place alive. They want it cheaper, faster. They don't care that the looms need rest. They don't care that the wool needs to be spun just so. They want a factory. This isn't a factory, it's a sanctuary. If you're the one taking the reins, then it's not a coup, it's a rescue." His support was the final piece. He became my man on the inside, my field marshal. He knew who was unhappy. He knew who was sentimental. He knew who was just holding on out of a sense of duty. He gave Alistair the roadmap to the shareholders' hearts. In less than a month, a period of time that would seem wildly implausible to anyone who has ever dealt with corporate acquisitions, Northern Textiles Holdings had secured 52% of the shares in Blackford Mill, a controlling stake. It was done. The quietest takeover in the history of Scottish textiles. It cost me nearly every penny of my severance and the bulk of Elspeth's inheritance. I was more financially exposed than I had ever been in my life, but I wasn't buying shares in a company. I was buying back my own narrative. I was buying the loom, the thread, and the needle. There was a subtle, almost laughable flaw in how corporate law seems to work with these old private companies. The transfer of shares, once agreed upon by the private parties, was legally binding. The notification to the mill's largest client, Guy's Fashion House, was a courtesy, not a requirement for approval. They had no say. They had spent years treating the mill like a replaceable cog in their machine, never once thinking to secure their supply chain with a partnership agreement, or heaven forbid, an ownership stake. They just assumed the wool would always be there, like water from a tap. They had all the leverage, until, Suddenly, they had none. I sat at my kitchen table, the final confirmation email from Alistair glowing on my screen. I was now, on paper, the majority owner of the very heart of the brand that had cast me out. The irony was so thick, I could taste it. It tasted like victory, and a little bit like my grandmother's shortbread. But owning the mill was just the foundation. The plan needed a second act. It needed a quiet, devastatingly effective trigger. It couldn't be a messy, obvious stoppage. That would be brutish. It had to be elegant. It had to be professional. I called Eamon. I said, Eamon, how long have you been telling me those old timber looms need a rest? How long have you wanted to do a proper modernization, to restore them instead of just patching them up? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, about 10 years. Management in New York always said it was too expensive. Too much downtime. I said, well, the new management has a different perspective. We're going to invest in the future. We're going to protect our assets. I want you to draw up a proposal for a complete loom overhaul, a modernization project. And I want it to be thorough. I want it to be meticulous. I want it to take as long as it takes. I could hear the smile in his voice. He said, indefinitely. Then, I said, that's a good word for it. Eamon. Indefinitely. He was to be the face of the project. A letter would be drafted, on Blackford Mill letterhead, addressed to the head of production at the fashion house. It would be a polite professional notice. Due to a critical and long overdue loom modernization project, required to ensure the long-term quality and viability of our heritage textile, all production will be suspended, effective immediately. We anticipate this vital work will take some time, and will update you on a new production timeline in due course. In due course. Corporate speak for don't hold your breath. It was perfect. It wasn't an attack. It was an investment in quality. It was a responsible business decision. I was using their own sterile corporate language against them. I was taking the soul of the company hostage, and I was doing it with a polite memo. Guy would get the letter. He probably wouldn't even read it himself. He'd pass it to some underling. They would panic a little. But they were already full steam ahead on their new collection. The one designed by the influencer. The one made with cheap synthetic fabrics from some factory in Southeast Asia. They wouldn't realize the magnitude of the problem at first. They didn't need the antique wool for their new exciting line. They thought they had already moved on. But they had forgotten about their clients. They had forgotten about the boutiques, the department stores, the loyal customers who had built the brand's reputation on the very quality they were now abandoning. They had forgotten that you can't just change the soul of a thing and expect no one to notice. I leaned back in my chair. The plan was in motion. The first domino was about to be pushed. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reminding a very arrogant boy about the first rule of fashion, the rule his father had taught me all those years ago. The fabric is everything, and I owned the fabric, all of it. The first move was a single quiet email, from my personal account, not the holding company's. I sent the finalized modernization proposal to Eamon. The subject line was simple. Our next chapter. He replied within minutes. A new dawn. Hazel. A new dawn. The official notice to Guy's company went out from the mill's administrative office an hour later. A little digital stone tossed into a very large, very placid pond. Now all I had to do was wait for the ripples. I didn't have to wait long. For the first week, there was nothing. A profound, unnerving silence. This, Eamon told me, was predictable. The letter would have landed in the inbox of a mid-level production coordinator, someone who likely forwarded it to their boss, who then flagged it for a weekly logistics meeting. In a company as bloated and inefficient as Guy was making it, a critical piece of information like your signature textile is no longer available. Moves with the speed of a glacier. They were too busy, too self-important, to notice the ground had just vanished beneath their feet. They were launching their new collection, the one designed by the influencer, whose name I believe was Lyrics, or something equally absurd. There were flashy parties, press releases filled with buzzwords, and an avalanche of Instagram posts. They were making noise. I was making moves. My first call as the new owner was not to a designer or a client, but to an engineer, a specialist in textile loom restoration. Eamon had a name, a man from Germany, who was the best in the world at restoring, not just replacing, antique machinery. The modernization project was real. I was genuinely investing in the mill, in its future. That was the beauty of it. My revenge was disguised as responsible ownership. I was building a better, stronger company, and the first unavoidable step was to cut off the supply to its most toxic client. Eamon was my eyes and ears. He'd call me every evening. His reports were delivered in his dry Scottish brogue, and they were more satisfying than any glowing review I'd ever received for a collection. He said the first call from the fashion house came a full 8 days after the notice was sent. It wasn't from Guy. It wasn't even from a vice president. It was from a frantic junior-level assistant in the production department. The kid was in a panic. He said, "What do you mean indefinitely? We have a capsule collection for fall that needs the Blackford tartan." Eamon, bless his stoic heart, was a fortress. He calmly read back the official statement. Long overdue modernization, ensuring long-term quality. In due course. He was polite, firm, and utterly unmovable. He said the assistant sounded like he was about to cry. 2 days later, the first reviews of the new Lyrics collection started to land. They were not just bad, they were catastrophic. The critics, the old guard fashion journalists, who, like me, had respected the house for its quality and craftsmanship, were merciless. They used words like cheap, flimsy, a betrayal of a great legacy. One particularly vicious review in a major trade publication described a dress as having the synthetic sheen of a cheap Halloween costume. They eviscerated the poor construction, the ill-fitting silhouettes, and most of all, the terrible lifeless fabrics. The influencer's 10 million followers might have liked her photos, but they weren't the ones spending $5,000 on a coat. The brand's actual customers, the ones with the money, were appalled. This is when the real panic started at Guy's end. Eamon said the calls became more frequent, and they started coming from higher up the food chain. A director of production called, shouting. A vice president of supply chain called, trying to cajole and then threaten. He mentioned contracts. Eamon calmly informed him that their annual purchasing agreement had expired 2 months prior, and Guy's office had never bothered to renew it. They had been operating on a per-order basis. Another piece of sloppy, arrogant oversight. They had no legal recourse. They had no leverage. They were just a customer. A customer whose calls were becoming increasingly shrill. The pinnacle of this phase was when Guy himself finally called the mill. Not Eamon. He demanded to speak to the owner. He wanted to talk to the head of Northern Textiles Holdings. Eamon, with what I can only imagine was a great deal of quiet satisfaction, informed him that all communications with the ownership group were handled through our legal counsel in Edinburgh. He gave him Alistair's number. Alistair called me immediately afterward. He was practically giddy. He said, "I've just had the most extraordinary conversation with a young man who seems to believe that shouting is a valid negotiation tactic." Guy had apparently tried to throw his weight around. He'd talked about the volume of their business, about their long history together. He demanded they halt the ridiculous modernization and get his tartan back into production immediately. Alistair, in his calm, imperturbable way, had simply listened. And when Guy was finished with his tirade, Alistair had replied, "Mr. Guy, my client is deeply committed to the long-term health and integrity of this historic mill. They believe that years of underinvestment have put the machinery at risk, and they will not compromise on quality. Production will resume when the work is complete. We will, of course, keep you informed." Guy was apoplectic. He demanded the owner's name. Alistair, citing client confidentiality, politely refused. The idea that he, Guy, the heir to the throne, couldn't get a name, couldn't get a meeting, couldn't get what he wanted by simply snapping his fingers, was completely outside his realm of experience. He was a king who had just discovered his decrees were meaningless. The beautiful, terrible symmetry of it all was that Guy was now trapped in a prison of his own making. He had publicly declared my work, the work that relied on the Blackford textile, as antique and irrelevant. He couldn't go to the press and complain that he couldn't get his supply of the antique textile. It would make him look like a fool and a hypocrite. He had staked his reputation on the new, cheap synthetic future, and that future was currently getting a 2-star rating from every major publication. Meanwhile, I was quietly laying the groundwork for my own future. I started making calls, not to investors or banks, but to people. I called the head of fabric purchasing at a major Parisian couture house, a man I'd known for years. I didn't try to sell him anything. I just told him I had taken over Blackford Mill. I told him we were undergoing a restoration to bring it back to its former glory. I told him that when we reopened, we would be producing a limited run, the highest quality we'd ever made. His response was immediate. He said, "Hazel, thank God. We thought it was lost. We can't find quality like that anywhere. Whatever you make, we'll take it. All of it." I made 3 more calls like that, to a bespoke menswear tailor in London, to a luxury interior design firm in New York, to a small, exclusive Japanese fashion house, known for its minimalism and obsession with materials. By the end of the week, before a single thread of new tartan had been woven, I had pre-sold the mill's entire production capacity for the next 2 years, at a 30% price increase. I was building a parachute, while Guy was discovering his was made of paper. The power hadn't just shifted. It had undergone a tectonic realignment. He was still sitting in his fancy boardroom, convinced of his own authority, while the foundations of his company were turning to sand. He was panicking, scrambling for a solution, sending angry emails, and making threatening phone calls. He had no idea that the antique he had so carelessly discarded was sitting at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea, and quietly dismantling his entire empire, one polite professional phone call at a time. He thought he was at war with an anonymous holding company. He was at war with his own history, and his history was about to call in its debts. The client exodus began not as a flood, but as a slow, steady leak that Guy and his team were too arrogant to notice until the floor was already underwater. It started with the small, independent boutiques, the ones in Paris, Milan, and Tokyo, the ones run by owners who, like me, built their reputations on an unerring eye for quality. They weren't just retailers, they were curators, and they were my first line of defense. I didn't have to poach them. I didn't have to do anything. The disastrous reviews of the Lyrics collection were all the incentive they needed. An old colleague, a sales director who had quit 2 weeks after I was fired, forwarded me a chain of emails that was pure poetry. It was from the owner of a legendary boutique in London. The email was addressed to Guy's new head of sales. It read simply, "We are canceling our entire fall's winter order. What you have sent us is not fashion. It is a disposable commodity. We have worked with your house for 30 years, since Arthur himself would deliver the coats. This is an insult to his memory and to our clients. Do not contact us again until you remember what your name is supposed to stand for." That one email was a cannonball. It was forwarded, blind copied, and whispered about. Soon the major department stores began to waver. Their buyers are not sentimentalists. They are sharks. They smell blood in the water. They saw the reviews. They saw the social media backlash from actual customers, not just the influencers' paid bots. And they started cutting their orders, first by 30%, then by 50%. They were creating space on their racks for brands that still stood for luxury. The most delicious part was the call I received from Catherine, the senior vice president for apparel at a department store that was the absolute pinnacle of American retail. She was a legend, a woman whose opinion could make or break a billion-dollar brand. She had been a friend and a mentor to me for years. We had a standing dinner date once a quarter. She called my cell. She said, "Hazel, what in God's name is happening over there? I just saw the new line. It looks like it was made for a teenager's television show." I played dumb. I told her I was no longer with the company. There was a moment of stunned silence on her end. Then she said, "Well, that explains everything. They let you go? Are they insane?" I told her I was taking some time off, figuring out my next move. And then I planted a small seed. I said, I've always wanted to do a small bespoke collection, something focused entirely on impeccable materials, like the old Blackford wool, if only one could still get it." Catherine seized on it immediately. She said, "Hazel, if you can get your hands on that textile, and you put your name on a label, I will give you an exclusive launch in our flagship store. I don't even need to see the sketches. Your name and that fabric are enough." The power of that statement hung in the air. My personal brand, the one Guy had tried to erase, was more powerful than the legacy brand he had inherited and was currently destroying. Meanwhile, Guy's desperation was reaching a fever pitch. He was bleeding money. The launch of the new line had been a multi-million-dollar disaster. Retailers were returning merchandise. His influencer creative director was getting roasted online, and there were rumors she was already looking for her next brand partnership. He was facing a catastrophic loss for the quarter, and the board, his father's old golfing buddies, were starting to ask pointed questions. Their golf games were being interrupted by calls from angry investors. His last desperate countermove was a pathetic attempt at a legal threat. Alistair received a blustering letter from a high-priced New York law firm, accusing Northern Textiles Holdings of tortious interference and acting in bad faith by deliberately halting production to harm their business. It was a Hail Mary, a legal tantrum. Alistair dismantled it with a 3-paragraph response. He pointed out, again, that there was no existing contract. He attached copies of the ignored emails from Eamon over the past year, detailing the deteriorating state of the looms and requesting investment for repairs, all of which were ignored by Guy's team. He concluded by stating that my client, Northern Textiles Holdings, had in fact saved the mill from the negligence of its primary customer and was acting in the best interests of its own business and employees. Any harm to Guy's company was a result of their own poor planning and deprioritization of their supply chain. The letter was a masterpiece of polite legal destruction. We never heard from the law firm again. They knew they didn't have a case. It was all bluster. This is when he must have finally made the connection. Or maybe one of the old board members, who remembered my passion for the mill, put 2 and 2 together. The timing of my departure, the sudden appearance of an anonymous holding company buying up the mill, the focus on quality and heritage in all communications. The puzzle pieces for him must have clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening snap. His office called Alistair. Not a lawyer this time. His personal assistant. Her voice was trembling. She said Mr. Guy would like to request a meeting with the principal of Northern Textiles Holdings. He was willing to fly to Scotland. Immediately, Alistair and I conferred. The time for hiding was over. The time for silence was past. It was time for the final confrontation. It was time for him to look his antique in the eye. Alistair replied to the assistant. He said my client will be available for a video conference tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. A link will be sent to Mr. Guy's calendar. I didn't sleep that night. Not from anxiety, but from a strange humming energy. It was the feeling one gets before the curtain rises. Everything I had worked for, every quiet phone call, every calculated risk, was leading to this single conversation. It was never about revenge. It was about a reckoning. It was about forcing a man who lived in a world of shallow optics to finally confront something real, something solid, something he had broken, and I had rebuilt. Tomorrow he would learn the true meaning of the word value, and I would be the one to teach him the lesson. The morning of the call, I dressed carefully, not in a power suit, not in anything that looked like corporate armor. I wore a simple, elegant cashmere sweater, a piece I had designed years ago. It was one of my favorites, a timeless design in a soft heather gray. I sat not in a sterile office, but in my own sunlit living room. Behind me you could see my bookshelves, filled with books on art, history, and design. There was a vase of fresh flowers on the table. The setting was deliberate. I was not meeting him as a corporate adversary. I was meeting him as Hazel, a person, the person he had tried, and failed, to erase. At precisely 9 a.m., the video call connected. His face appeared on my screen. He looked terrible. His usually perfect hair was slightly askew. There were dark circles under his eyes. He was in the main conference room, the same one where he had fired me. The irony was almost too perfect. He was alone. He stared at my face on the screen. For a full 5 seconds, there was no recognition. He was looking for a man, a stern-faced corporate raider, a titan of industry. He was looking for someone who looked like his father. And then he saw me. The change in his expression was the most satisfying victory I could have ever imagined. It wasn't a sudden shock. It was a slow-motion collapse. Confusion, then disbelief, then a dawning, horrified understanding. The blood drained from his face. He looked like he had seen a ghost. He whispered my name, Hazel. I gave him a small, calm smile. "Hello, Guy. It's good to see you again. You wanted to speak with the owner of Blackford Mill. You're speaking to her." He just stared, his mouth slightly agape. He opened it to say something, then closed it again. He looked utterly lost. A child who had just discovered the monster under his bed was real. I decided to begin. I kept my tone even, pleasant, almost conversational. It wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. "I understand you're having some supply chain issues," I said. "We received a rather passionate letter from your lawyers." He finally found his voice, though it was thin and reedy. "Hazel, I don't understand. How? How is not important, Guy," I replied, my voice still soft. "What's important is the situation. You see, the mill was in a terrible state, years of neglect. The previous management just didn't see the value in proper investment. They were more focused on short-term profits than on long-term stability. So, I decided to step in. I'm a big believer in heritage. You know, I think it's important to preserve these beautiful old things, to modernize them, so they don't become what was the word you used? Ah yes, antique." The word hit him like a physical blow. He flinched. The color was starting to return to his face, a blotchy, angry red. He sputtered, "You did this deliberately. You're sabotaging my company." I raised an eyebrow. "Sabotage? Guy, I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm fixing it. I'm restoring priceless, historic machinery. I'm investing in craftsmanship. I'm doing all the things a responsible owner should do. The fact that this vital work is inconvenient for you is a consequence of your own business decisions, not mine. You're the one who decided this textile was no longer relevant to your brand's future. I simply took you at your word. I'm giving it a new future." He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the polished conference table. He was trying to regain some semblance of control, to put on his CEO face. He said, "What do you want, Hazel? Money? Do you want to sell the mill back to me? Name your price." I almost laughed. The pathetic, predictable response of a man who believes everything has a price tag. I let the silence stretch for a moment, enjoying the sight of his desperation. "I don't want your money, Guy. You don't have enough, and the mill is not for sale. What I wanted was this conversation. I wanted you to understand the value of things you can't easily quantify on a spreadsheet. Loyalty, craftsmanship, history. You inherited a kingdom, and you thought the throne was the source of its power. You never understood that the power came from the land, from the people, from the very thread that ran through everything, and you let it all go because you were chasing something loud and bright and temporary. He finally broke, all the pretense fell away, and he was just a scared, cornered man. He said, "Please, Hazel, the board is going to fire me. The company is falling apart. We need the tartan. I'll give you your old job back. A promotion, head of all creative, whatever you want." It was the ultimate insult, dressed up as a peace offering. He still didn't get it. He thought I wanted to come back. He thought I wanted a seat at his crumbling table. I gave him a pitying look. My old job. Guy, why would I want to be a queen in your kingdom of ruins when I've already built my own? I'm afraid you're a little late. The entire production capacity of Blackford Mill has already been sold, for the next 2 years, to clients who appreciate its quality and are willing to pay for it. He deflated. It was like watching the air go out of a balloon. The fight was gone. The anger was gone. All that was left was the hollow shell of a man who had been completely and utterly outplayed. I delivered the final closing line. "It's a shame, really. Your father built a beautiful house. It just needed a solid foundation. And you, Guy, you were never interested in foundations. You were only ever interested in the view from the top floor. Enjoy it while it lasts." I didn't wait for a reply. I reached out and clicked the end call button. The screen went blank. It was over. 2 weeks later, the news broke in the industry trades. Guy was out. The board, facing a shareholder revolt, had forced his resignation. The company was being sold for parts. Its name, once a synonym for timeless elegance, was now a cautionary tale. The influencer had already scrubbed any mention of the brand from her social media feeds. I was in Scotland when I heard the news. I was at the mill, standing with Eamon on the factory floor. The German engineers were working meticulously on the first of the old timber looms. The air smelled of wood oil and cool, damp stone. It was the smell of something real being cared for. Eamon handed me a small framed object. It was a swatch of the very first run of the Blackford tartan, woven over a century ago. He said, "Arthur would have wanted you to have this." I took it. The wool was heavy and rich in my hands. It felt solid. It felt permanent. It felt like the truth. So here I am. In the end, it wasn't really about Guy. He was just a symptom of a larger disease, the idea that value is disposable, that history is a burden, and that craft can be replaced by hype. He didn't understand that the things that last, the things that have real enduring worth, are not the loudest things in the room. They are the quiet, steady and resilient things, the things that are built with care, with skill, and with a respect for the soul of the work. My story isn't unique. Maybe it happened to you in a different way. Maybe it was an idea that was stolen, a promotion that was denied, a contribution that was erased. We are taught to be quiet, to be loyal, to let our work speak for itself. But I learned a very hard and very valuable lesson. The work cannot speak for itself if no one is willing to listen. Sometimes you have to stop speaking for the work and start owning it. You have to buy the mill. What I did, some people would call it revenge, and maybe it was, a little, but I'd prefer to think of it as a restoration. I restored a historic mill to its former glory. I restored the faith of the clients who believed in quality, and most importantly, I restored my own belief in the value of my work, on my own terms. I took back my narrative, and I have to say, the fabric of this new story is the finest I have ever worked with. Thank you for listening to my story. It's important for these stories to be told. If this resonated with you, if you've ever felt overlooked or undervalued, please do me a favor, like this video, and leave a comment below sharing a piece of your own story. Let's create a community where quiet competence is finally given a voice. Share this with anyone you think needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about turning the tables. Remember, your value is not determined by those who cannot see it. it's determined by you.